Hey everyone. So today we are going to look into inheritance in C Sharp. So in the last video we talked about classes, right? And if you remember or know you want to go back and see the previous video, we created a student class wherein we talked about a class can have data as well as some methods. So we represented data as properties in class, and then we talked about how we can create methods and also what's the role of constructor in classes. So so usually, right, in a program that you write, you usually create multiple classes, and inheritance is one way to define relationship between multiple classes. And the type of relationship that we use to define using inheritance is a relationship. So let's take an example. Let's say we have two classes. Okay. So what I'll do is, so we already have a student class. I'm going to uh, go ahead and let's create an animal class. So I'll say add class. So I'll call this class as animal. So let's have an animal class. So what I'll do is I'll create a constructor, a default constructor. So I'll just print out console dot write line an animal, right? Class with one constructor. So let's create another class. Let's call it as dog. Okay, so I have a dog class. Now this dog class, let's also create a constructor, a default constructor for this dog class. So I'll say line a dog. Now animal class would have some properties, right? Some data that would be stored as part of animal. Let's say let's create a property. I'll call it as the data type would be string, and I'll say name of the animal. Okay, and all the animals they probably have a name, right? So let's say I have a name property, and probably let's say I have an age property as well. So so int age. So two properties I have as part of my animal class. And let's say we create a method as well. So for animal, let's say I'll create a public. Let's see, I would say void. I have a method called as sleep. So call it as animal is sleeping. Okay, and let's create one more method. Let's call it as animal is eating. All right. Okay, so I have this class ready. It's an animal class. It has a few properties, a default constructor, and few methods, right? So now the thing is that this dog class is dog entity is actually also an animal, right? So there's no point that we define these properties and methods again in a dog class. What we can do is we can reuse all of these properties and methods in our dog class as well, right? And then extend it if we have any specific dog related methods or properties that we want to store. So how do we do inherit from a class in C# is using these colon character. So I can say class dog derives from animal. So as soon as I do this, what would happen is all the properties, the public, basically the private methods that I have and the properties as well, they would get inherited in this dog class, right? So we'll talk about access modifiers later on. That no, if for example, let's say, sorry, this is not the right class. So for example, if these properties and methods, they are not public, right, or protected or private, how does it affect the inheritance, right? Are they exposed to the child class or not, right? So we'll come to that later on. Okay, so I have my dog class. So what I'll do is I'll go to my program.cs. Let's create a instance of animal class, right? Animal1 animal. Okay, let's set its property. Let's say animal1 dot age equals to 2. Animal1 dot let's say name equals to companion. Do we have another property? We just have these two properties, right? Okay. As soon as so this is good, and then let's probably call the two methods as well. Animal1 dot let's say, let's give them something to eat. So I'll call the eat method first, and then I'll call the sleep method. Okay, so I think we are good. So let's run this application. So an instance of animal class was created. So the default constructor ran. So it says I'm an animal, animal is eating, animal is sleeping. Okay, so this is all good. Now let's create an instance of a dog class, right? So let's say dog1 equals to new dog. So I'll say dog1 dot c. So you get all the properties of from the animal class here, right? So equals to, let's call dog Bruce. Dog1 dot age equals to 4. And what's happening? Okay, and then we can also call all the methods from the animal class on a dog instance, right? Because dog is inheriting from the animal class. So I can make the dog to eat. I can also make the dog to sleep. Okay. So now, in order to better understand this, let's go back to the animal class. And instead of hard coding an animal here, what we can do is I'll probably say this dot name, okay, is sleeping, right? So whatever the name of the animal or the dog is, we'll just append prefix that right, that name to this to is sleeping string. Similarly, I'll do that here as well. So I'll say this name plus equals to is eating, right? So I think this makes more sense. That's why if I go back now, it should actually tell me that Minion is eating, is sleeping, and then Bruce is eating and Bruce is sleeping. Okay, so I'm an animal. I'm a dog. Bruce is eating. Bruce is sleeping. Right. So you get an idea, right, how inheritance works. So now, right, so one benefit that we see here from inheritance is that you created these methods and properties, and you know that the child class would actually use all of these properties and methods, and then you don't have to define them again, correct? But in this child class, you could have certain methods or properties which are specific to this particular child class. Correct. So it cannot be that the child class is exactly same as the parent class, then there's no point to create a child class. So in this case, let's create just one more method. So I'll call it as public void bark, right? Because dogs bark is the dot right line, and I'll say this dot name plus Bruce is barking. Okay. So now if I go back to my program class, you see that this animal class cannot call bark on animal class, right? Because this method is just available in the child class, but you can call dog1 dot bark because this method definition is available in dog class. So let's print it out. Okay, so Bruce is barking. So a dog can do everything that an animal can do, but this dog can also perform other activities, or like no, in this case, it can also bark. Okay, so this is how inheritance works in C#. So now let's say that there are like few things about inheritance, right? So let's go back to animal class. Now I can also, let's say if I have a dog class and I don't want anybody else to extend this class, right? So I want to enforce that, okay, nobody should inherit from this dog class. What I can do is I can use a sealed uh, specifier. So now if I try to create another class and try to inherit from dog class, it would not allow me to do that, right? So sealed basically actually means, I think if I hover it, it would probably say, give some definition. It's not, but let's do one thing, right? Let's create another class. Let's say, so I'll probably just call it as class bulldog, and I'll try to inherit from dog. Okay. If I do that, you see a compile time error here saying that bulldog cannot derive from sealed type dog, correct? So if you want to restrict inheritance for a class that you have defined, you can use the sealed modifier, right? Okay. So this is about inheritance, and this is about how we can restrict our classes. Now, if I go back to my parent class, okay. So what, for example, in this particular case, I want to have, no, all my child classes want to use these methods, but they want to override this functionality, right? In that case, what we can do is we can define here that, okay, this public, so I can use a keyword which is called virtual, right? So I can say public virtual void sleep, which basically means that in my derived class, so I can say public override void. Okay. So this basically means that I'm trying to override the functionality from my child class. So whenever a dog.sleep is called, in that particular case, this whatever that you write in this piece of method would be executed instead of what was specified in the sleep method of the parent class, right? So this is how you use virtual methods, that you can override the functionality in your child classes. Now there's also like if you, so in this case, right, you have to give a definition of your method in the class. But if you do not want to give the definition in your class, let's just probably just call paste.sleep for now, but you can override this with anything that you want, right? So let's say I want to define another method and I'm running out of names. Let's say I'll call it as public. Let's just call it as run, right? Public void run. Now, but I don't have a functionality that I want to define in my parent class. In that case, what I can do is I can mark this method as abstract. But as soon as you mark something as abstract, this basically means that this whole class has to become abstract, right? Because there is no definition of this method, and the child classes are supposed to provide the definition of this particular method. So you cannot create an instance of this class. So either you have to mark this class as abstract or give some definition and then use a virtual keyword so that the child classes can override the functionality. So in this case, what I'll do is just mark this class as abstract. Okay. Now, once you mark a class as abstract and you try to inherit that class, you have to make sure that all the abstract methods of that particular class are overridden, right, in your child class. So I click here. So I'll say implement abstract class, and it is going to override my run method, and by default it's just throwing a not implemented exception. So we'll talk about exception handling later on, but in this case I can just say something. I can say console dot write line whatever running, right? Okay. Okay, so let's quickly recap, right, what we just saw. So we saw that so if you have to set up an is a relationship between multiple classes, then you use inheritance. So you have something called as a base class, which would have some properties as well as some methods, and then you have a child class which inherits from that particular class. Now, if you do not want your class to be inherited, then you can use a seal keyword. Right, and in your so all the functionality in your base class would be available in your child class. So once you start calling or using the properties of your base class from your child class, you can do that. At the same time, if you want to override any functionality in the child class, you can either use the virtual keyword, or there's also a keyword called as new in a scenario where you want to specify to the compiler that okay, that this is the functionality from my parent class, but this is the functionality that I want to use for my child classes, right? So you can either use virtual, or you can use the new keyword to mark that okay, this is the new definition of your method in your child class. And finally, we also saw that okay, if you do not want to provide the definition of your method in your base class, you can mark it as abstract, but that means that okay, you also have to mark your class as abstract, and no, you cannot create an instance of that class. So as soon as we mark this class as abstract, you saw there's an error here saying that you cannot instantiate an abstract type, right, or interface animal. Okay, so I'll probably have to. Okay, finally, so now you could argue that this base class, we could have like multiple methods. All of these methods are, if all of your methods are abstract, and I think if all of the methods are that's the only thing that is part of your classes, then you can also use interfaces, right? So we'll have another session specifically on interfaces, and we'll also see like why you should be using base classes versus interfaces in C#. Okay, so that's all about inheritance. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.